Hi guys, I'm just another guy named James, and today I'm going to be talking about the Wonder Man one-shot from 1986. Now, this one-shot was written by David Michelinie, drawn by Kerry Gamble, and inked by Vince Colletta. Now, for some of you out there, depending on how avid of a comic book fan you are, hearing that it was inked by Vince Colletta can either spark joy or anger. And honestly, I think this is some of his best work when it comes to inking. So yeah, that's nice. But yeah, Wonder Man's a character that's honestly one of Marvel's oldest characters, coming out in either 63 or 64. So that puts him on the same age tier as, Iron Man, Daredevil. Not quite Thor. Thor was a couple of years older. But he's really one of Marvel's oldest characters. But he's just so forgotten about in the grand scheme of things. And that's mostly, I think, due to his name. Nobody wants to read a comic about the guy called Wonder Man. Because you hear that name and you think, this is a parody, right? And honestly, that is kind of a fair assumption. But Wonder Man is a character with a really interesting backstory, and we'll see that as we dive into the one-shot. But honestly, he's one of my favorite Marvel characters. He's an integral part of the West Coast Avengers, and yeah, I have a whole video on that limited series from the 80s. If you'd like to check that out, it'll be linked down in the description. But West Coast Avengers is one of my favorites. Wonder Man's one of my favorite characters in that comic. In the normal Avengers comic, he's a great addition to the roster. And it's just he's just one of those characters that, while maybe not super iconic, is just a really good, solid character. And honestly, I would love to see him in a couple of movies coming up soon, and I'll say at the end of the video who I think would be the perfect casting choice for this character. But I am gonna just hop into our story, which begins with Simon Williams, Wonder Man's real name, failing at an audition for a movie. Because Wonder Man, at this point in his history, Wonder Man's a stunt actor. He was a stunt actor. He's trying to get into serious acting. But he fails his audition. So he gets a taxi. He hops in a taxi to get back to Avengers Mansion, and while he's in the taxi, he's reminiscing about his origins. His origins really pretty simple. He inherited his father's company. He made a lot of mistakes. He embezzled a lot of money. And he was sentenced to some time in jail. And then Baron Zemo, the leader of the Masters of Evil, offered to break Simon Williams out of jail in exchange for some help doing some ionic ray experiments. So Wonder Man says, sure. So he was a little confused, a little disoriented. Nothing to lose. Well, he lost it all. So Zemo's experiments worked, gave him incredible strength and durability, and Zemo started calling him Wonder Man. He also gave him a place in He also gave Wonder Man a place in the Masters of Evil, a group of villains who were destined to fight the Avengers. And while Wonder Man was fighting the Avengers, he realized that he was being used as a tool. So he turned against the Masters of Evil, and then he died at the end of that battle. But before he could be buried, his body was stolen by Wonder Man's brother, the Grim Reaper, and then he was resurrected by a voodoo Hogan called the Black Talon. He was animated as a zombie, and again sent out against the Avengers. And ironically, the truth of the story is Wonder Man was never truly dead. He was just in a comatose state while the ionic bombardment had he had undergone continued to change his body. And eventually, he was returned to consciousness, and he discovered that he was a being of pure energy, and no longer truly human. But the Avengers welcomed him back with open arms, and they accepted him, but Wonder Man couldn't accept himself as an Avenger, mostly because they were all so at ease, laying everything that they had, their lives, on the line, and Wonder Man wasn't. After spending so much time as a dead man, the idea of dying again kind of scared him. So he had his friend Hercules, a fellow Avenger, get Wonder Man into some Hollywood contacts. And Wonder Man is brought out of this reminiscing when he realizes he's stuck in traffic with the meter running on his taxi. So he decides to just lift his taxi out of the traffic. At Avengers Mansion, Wonder Man bumps into Ant-Man, who's not currently an Avenger and is just working on some of the mansion's security systems. So the two heroes catch up for a second or two before Wonder Man goes off to the training room. And he's really bothered by his inability to find work. So after a few minutes of training, we see Scott Lang freeze the session and give Wonder Man a contact at an old Stark International subsidiary, before turning the training program back on and leaving Wonder Man to take a hard hit. So the next morning, Wonder Man heads off to Cordco, that's the Stark subsidiary, and meets the head of the company, Mr. Oakley, who explains that the purpose of Cordco is to experiment with some unusual ideas, and that Wonder Man's job would be to help solve any problems that may arise from such experimental work. As the tour of the facility is happening, we see that one of the scientists is looking to peek into other dimensions, and after taking a huge amount of power, we see that the machine is working. We then cut to Wonder Man in the office of Dulcie Kimball, who is his direct report. Wonder Man also learns that he doesn't have to breathe from the lab tests that Cordco does on him. We then see back in the lab that an army of gnomes has broken through the dimensional barrier and are fighting their way through Cordco, so Wonder Man has to put a stop to them. But he has some trouble fighting the gnomes head on, so he goes straight for the machine that brought them to Cordco. And he pulls the plug, sending all the gnomes home. Later that night, we see the same scientist from earlier sneaking into the lab to reignite his machine. And as Wonder Man and the rest, but this time Mr. Oakley is sucked into the alternate reality, and so the alternate reality washing into the real world. So Mr. Oakley's sucked in, and the scientist sounds the alarm. And as Wonder Man and the rest of the security team are gearing up for action, Wonder Man is paged for an Avengers mission that calls for his immediate attention. So he flies off, leaving Cordco to clean up its own mess. Wonder Man arrives on the scene at a medical research center where the cancer-ridden Sandman is attempting to give himself chemotherapy with nuclear rods. And given the extreme radiation, Wonder Man is the only one who can stop him. While Wonder Man is on his way to the cooling pool, he does some introspection, thinking about how he and Sandman both fear death, and how he's now risking his life to save all of New York from the Sandman. So Wonder Man comes up to Sandman, who's pulling more rods, and the two begin to fight. Wonder Man's immediate thought is to use the fire hose to turn Sandman to mud, but the valve's been melted, so the two keep their fist fight going for a while, until Wonder Man realizes, wait, I can just grab the pipe, there's still water in it. So that's what he does. He grabs the pipe and hoses down the heavily irradiated Sandman. Then he has to push down all of the rods to avoid a full nuclear meltdown, which he does. And he also siphons off the residual radiation from the Sandman using more of the nuclear rods. And this act ends up curing Sandman's cancer. And then to end the story, we see Wonder Man fly back to Cordco, and we see that the situation had resolved itself, as Dulcie Kimball was able to get Mr. Oakley out of the alternate dimension. Ultimately, everyone agrees that it's best for Wonder Man to leave the company and become a full-time hero again. So honestly, it's a pretty open and shut story, this Wonder Man one-shot. It's not great, it's not life-changing, it's not deep and introspective. It's just a tight story. And honestly, that's probably what I like the most about it. It doesn't try to be deeper than it is. It just accepts what it is, and it gives you what you want out of a Wonder Man one shot. A story where we get to see Wonder Man's character progress, but not progress so much that if you're just reading the Avengers comics, you'll have no idea what happened. And it's just a nice story in that way, where we see him just kind of working to get over his fear instead of just completely conquering it. And I do like that the resolution of the story does make Wonder Man pick between one of the two worlds he's trying to live in right now, and that he chooses to be a superhero. And honestly, the writing on this story is just really good. It's David Michelinie. He was the Avengers writer for a very long time. He has one of the best runs on Iron Man. He wrote Spider-Man for a long time also. He's just one of those guys that for Marvel I think is one of their, not necessarily one of the best, but one of my favorites. And yeah, I like how this story sets up for where we see Wonder Man in the West Coast Avengers Limited series. That's really nice. It basically just catches you up with a character who had been all but missing from comics for a couple of years. And yeah, it's just a nice story. Something that is weird about it though is it came out well into the West Coast Avengers monthly run, and yet it takes place before the West Coast Avengers Limited series. But it serves the purpose of explaining, hey, why was Wonder Man so willing to answer the call to be a West Coast Avenger? When last we saw him, he was walking away from the Avengers with a smile and a nod. And honestly, for that, I really like it. It retroactively fills a gap. But yeah, realistically, the art in this story, nothing spectacular. But I would recommend it if you find it for $1 or $2. Definitely worth a buy, worth a read. And it is just one of those super solid Marvel stories. And yeah, it's just good. It's just good, heroic story. It's just good seeing like your hero being heroic and all that. Oh, and earlier I mentioned how there's a specific actor that I would cast to be Wonder Man. Well, you've seen what the character looks like throughout this video. And let me just say, if Marvel wants to absolutely crush the Wonder Man character, you have Henry Cavill be Wonder Man, okay? I know he was Superman for however long, and he never really got to shine in that role. But I think if you got the right writer behind Henry Cavill, he would make a fantastic Wonder Man. And honestly, there's no one else really that I can think of that would be like, that has the look to be Wonder Man. Like there's no one else who's really big, big and strong like Wonder Man is anymore. At least, with that has like the black hair, I guess. because for me that's like one of the big requirements. But anyway, that's a big digression. Overall, solid story. Would recommend. This is one of those stories. The writing's better than the art, and that's not a bad thing. Alright, that's all I've got for you today. I'll see you next time. But in the meantime, I'm just another guy named James. See ya.